Hello, friends. This is the Alphalist podcast. I am your host, Toby. The goal of the Alphalist podcast is to empower CTOs with the info and insight they need to make the best decisions for their company. We do this by hosting top thought leaders and picking their brains for insights into technical leadership and tech trends. If you believe in the power of accumulated knowledge to accelerate growth, make sure to subscribe to this podcast. Plus, if you're an experienced CTO, you will love the discussion happening in our Slack space where over 600 CTOs are sharing insights, or visit one of our events. Just go to alphalist.com to apply. So, welcome to the Alphalist podcast. I am your host, Toby, and my guest today is generously taking a break from his summer holidays in Germany just to record a podcast with me. The guy is originally from Berlin, and he has one of the most exciting jobs in tech, I would say. Not in tech, I would say. He's the CEO of GitHub, and his name is Thomas. So welcome on the show, Thomas.
Thank you so much for having me. And yeah, no taxes involved.
Luckily, eh? I can't imagine the most exciting job in Texas.
Probably also artificial intelligence, I guess.
Most likely. Thomas, you originally built an app called Hockey App and sold it to Microsoft. And I guess that's why you are where you are today. But maybe we can start a little earlier with your nerd path. I always tend to say, why did you get into computing and what did you originally do?
Yeah, we're here in Berlin at the AI campus, and it's actually not too far from where I grew up in East Berlin, in a suburb called Berlin-Marzahn during the 80s. And, I fell in love with technology as much as I had access to it with calculators and little electronics and whatnot, and or more electrics than electronics. And I saw, a computer in the geography lab in school. I think it was like a Robotron KC85 or 87, something like that. And the teacher graciously allowed us to hack with this. And works very similar to, Commodore 64. You had to use BASIC to load software from a cassette tape back then. And then, the wall fell and bought a Commodore 64 myself and started coding. And fell in love with creating stuff with software, and that became my passion as a kid. And we built little, applications, did a lot of gaming after school or in between school. I lived very close to school, and so usually on Wednesday afternoons, all my friends came over and we played like computer games until in the 7th or 8th hour we had like PE sports. And coded stuff, and so I got into coding, and ultimately that became my profession. Actually, during high school, I already started like a small business building insurance software.
Okay, and what is your favorite language these days? Like, do you still every once in a while code, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think Ruby is forever my love. It's easy to build stuff with Ruby. And then as I've been a mobile developer ever since the iPhone came out or the iPhone SDK came out, it's Swift and to a certain degree Objective-C. That's what I do the most. Especially as my hobby projects are mostly stuff that I build for myself, and so they run on my phone because that's what I have with me wherever I go. And so it's a mix of Swift and on the client and Ruby on the server.
Okay, and you still do that. Is it at GitHub? Is Ruby still popular? Like I can imagine that there's like maybe two hearts beating in the company. That like one is like likes the legacy stack, and like the other one is absolutely against it. Is that the case, or?
I mean, I wouldn't say against it, but there's different languages for different jobs, and so we're still using a lot of Ruby on Rails. We're running a large monolith, and we are on the edge of the latest Rails releases, and that won't change for the foreseeable future. GitHub is almost 16 years old, or the first commit is almost 16 years ago, and so we will forever have most of that code. And at the same time, we have modern applications like our mobile apps are written in Swift and Kotlin, and we have stuff in Go and Rust and whatnot. And so we have a multi system, multi-service application. But yeah, there's a lot of Ruby on Rails developers at GitHub, and I don't think that's going to change. And certainly not as long as I'm the CEO.
Very nice. Can you tell us a bit more about like your personal journey on why you actually became the CEO, not the CTO of GitHub? Like how did that happen?
Yes, I already mentioned, I was in love with software development as a kid, and went to a technical university here in Berlin. And during that time, I had a mentor from Mercedes-Benz, or back then Daimler Chrysler. And so that's how I moved from Berlin down to Stuttgart and worked for a while in the automotive industry and did lots of test drives and stuff that I liked for a certain amount of time. But then it put me back into real software development, especially with the iPhone SDK coming out and then having these beautiful devices in our pockets. I became an independent, software contractor, built lots of iPhone apps, and then built an application called Hockey App, which was a developer platform for mobile apps, for mobile app developers. Solved some pain points that we had when we built our own apps together with German companies, distributing beta versions, collecting crash reports, all that stuff. And that company got acquired by Microsoft in late 2014. We were a 10-person shop, all self-funded small companies. So it was obvious that we wouldn't be fully submerged or assimilated into Microsoft. And then part of the deal was that the founders had to move to Redmond, and that got me over into the West Coast universe of software development, and started at Microsoft as a product manager. Made my way through the hierarchy, and then in 2018, Nat Friedman had the idea of buying GitHub, and
it was his idea.
It was his idea. Yeah. It was his idea, and he wrote a strategy memo. And obviously, as soon as you start doing that in a large company like Microsoft, there's lots of other parties involved that help you, figuring out all the financials and the financial model and the integration system. And then he was looking for somebody who was kind of like pulling all the strings behind the scenes, the deal lead or the deal execution manager, or whatever you want to call that.
Yeah.
And I became that person in June of 2018. Getting the deal from the original announcement all the way to deal close, and making sure that we actually can start working at GitHub. And as the deal close came into it, was like weeks away or so, Nat asked me whether I want to join the GitHub leadership team with him, and I was like, what would I do? And he's like, I don't know, we figured that out, and ultimately became the vice president of special projects. And kind of like my first project was making private repositories free. At the time, 2018, you still had to pay.
I remember that.
Private repos, you had to pay for them. Public repos were free. And so I picked up all these special projects until Nat decided to leave GitHub and pursue other ventures. And I became the CEO in November 2021.
That's great. Like from integration manager, quote unquote, to CEO. That's really, really cool.
We didn't really integrate GitHub, right? Like
Not so much, right? Not so much. I mean, that's also like a key change in Microsoft's acquisition strategy, right? To not integrate too deeply, or
depends. I think depending on what company Microsoft is buying, there's different integration models. The kind of like independent version we have seen now. Different companies following that path. Minecraft, I'd say was the first one, or merging the company with product, obviously Minecraft, which is still a very independent brand, runs on all the platforms. LinkedIn, probably the biggest by now, and GitHub followed that model in 2018 for similar reasons, that we figured that you need to leave GitHub, cloud neutral, vendor neutral, ultimately. You need to preserve its position within the open source ecosystem to realize the value of the deal for Microsoft.
Interesting. One question which puzzled me a lot is like, where do you report to in Microsoft? Is there like some, I don't know, committee, or is it like I don't know where do you report to?
No, we Microsoft, which is now 40 years old by the time we're recording this podcast, has always been a developer company. If you think about what actually was the first product that Microsoft launched in the 70s, it was a basic interpreter. before then, the DOS and Windows waves came. And so Microsoft for a long time had what's called the developer division or DevDiv. And so GitHub is part of that developer division. And my manager, Julia Liusen, is the president of the developer division. And so we are very close, to teams like the .NET, the team that's building .NET and all the .NET tooling, obviously Visual Studio, which has been around for over 20 years, and the VS Code team, and all the other, teams that are building developer tools and developer services.
Okay.
And so there's no comedy. I have a manager, she's the president, and she has other, corporate vice presidents within Microsoft that run parts of that developer division, and ultimately, large developer tools, together with, if you think about it, what does a developer really need, right? You need some editor, and the most popular by far now is VS Code. You need a developer collaboration platform like GitHub, and then you need some kind of like chat system, Slack or Teams or Discord or whatever. Those are the three ingredients that every developer needs, and Microsoft owns, I'd say two of the most popular, and then Teams if you want to use that, and
it's interesting how Microsoft went through this like really interesting pivot. I still remember like the 90s or whenever it was, I had like the German Linux magazine on my desk, and there was like a Microsoft anti-Linux ad back then with like a penguin, like a mutated penguin in it. Interesting how it all went by, right? And how time passed by, and where you stand right now, right?
I think the world of software development has changed so many times, and has always, come in waves, and then the waves go, and there's a new big thing. And I remember those times too at the Linux magazine. And then when I started university in '98, everybody was buying a CT as I think 300 pages magazine, and probably those times are gone too, where students do that as a kind of like automatic thing. And before that, we had the first magazine I think I bought on a regular basis was 64, like the magazine for Commodore 64. And it had listings printed, and you didn't actually type the listings. It was like checksums. And so you had to send a postcard, and then they sent you back a disk with a decoder software for those checksums. And so instead of typing all the listings, you type checksums because they could print them in much less space than the actual listings. And then it would convert all these checksums back to code, right? That was how we were distributing open source, not the actual open source, more like public domain source code, I guess. And then came open source. And as always with new technology, there was a lot of fear around it. And, we're here at the AI campus, and it's ironically the same fears that we have now about AI 25 years ago, we had about open source, security, compliance, privacy, ownership, legacy, who's maintaining all that stuff, in 10 years. Time came, we didn't solve a lot of these problems. And, Log4j was probably the clearest example in recent history where security is still, open source security and software security, quite frankly, is still a big problem that we have to figure out. And but the world has moved on, because the reality is no company can outcompete, the millions of open source developers that are collaborating with each other every single day, 24/7, if you will, especially on weekends for because it's the hobby of those developers. And so you would be crazy to start a new project and not pull in some open source library, leverage an open source operating system, programming language, containers, all that is open source, and nobody starts with checksums anymore or buys commercial software, really.
Never underestimate the power of intrinsic motivation, right?
Well, and competition. Right? At the end of the day, you're building a new startup, whether it's here in Berlin or in San Francisco and Seattle. You are a small team, and your biggest benefit is that you can focus on something and then be open-minded of what components you're getting from the outside, because you realize that 2 or 3 founders or how many or whatever person you have in your team will not be able to otherwise outcompete the large tech companies that exist everywhere.
So looking back 20 years, could you imagine that this might happen, that you end up operating a company, leading a company that I don't know is very innovative in AI and is kind of helping people to automatically code, like without any, like, I mean, remembering those magazines and the printed code in them, like that's a crazy shift, right?
I mean, I think, if I look 20 years ago, that was like 2003. I don't think I could have imagined that in 2023, companies like GitHub, company or HashiCorp or Datadog actually could be that successful and reach that kind of scale, right? Like, sure, GitHub sold to Microsoft at 7.5 billion 5 years ago. Who knows what the value would be now? If
you might know.
Well, you can just, the one. It's public knowledge that this was an all-stock deal, and you can just take the stock price that Microsoft had at the time and take the stock price you have today, and kind of like take the same multiplier. It's about 3. And so, by that logic, GitHub would be worth $20-something billion, which would be a nicely sized public company. But I think, 20 years ago, that seemed like still science fiction. It seemed like science fiction that just a couple of hackers could take some open source, collaborate with people all around the world. I mean, a remote first company where you would just work from everywhere in the world and jump on video calls and communicate on Slack. Even that seemed like science fiction.
It's a bit like the Matrix, right?
And nowadays you walk through Berlin and everybody has their smartphone in their hands, right? They have an Android phone. You can't really go anywhere where that's not the case, and they're all using software. And so in many ways, I don't think I could have predicted that future, but it also, like, if I could go back and tell myself that would be happening, I would be so happy, because I think this is we're living in an amazing world where you can communicate, with your family from everywhere on the planet and send them photos or do FaceTime and or work, quite frankly, with your laptop and a satellite connection.
Yeah, absolutely. What's your vision for GitHub?
The ultimate vision for us is, that we want to be the home of all developers. That has been, our tagline for quite a while. And part of GitHub has always been developer collaboration, it being the place where developers come, share their code, collaborate, forking a repo, taking that work, doing whatever you want to do with this, sending it back as a pull request if you'd like, finding an issue to send some feedback. And, taking that source code and all these other projects that are on GitHub to accelerate human progress and help, the world to build more software. The crazy thing is we are writing millions and millions and millions of lines of code every day around on this planet. And we're still running code from the 60s. And you don't have to go too far to find a bank or, the German tax authorities or whatnot that all run still COBOL on mainframes from the 60s, or I think 50 something is the oldest I've heard so far. And in the meantime, they're thinking about transforming that into a modern stack, and that will take years. And then even if you have that achieved, then we still have the code from the 60s and the 70s and 80s and the 90s, right? Like, we're running all this legacy code and we're adding more and more code. And so the job of the software developer, in a way, is to manage this exponentially growing code base. And we have this dream of removing all the tech debt. And my joke always is, you're not actually paying off the debt. You're just refinancing from whatever was the last big thing into the new big thing. And there's always the next big thing on the horizon already. Right? It's like used to be jQuery, and now it's
while you did like half of it, you already see that and want to move on to the next thing, right?
And so I think, it's an exciting world because so many people use software to run their lives and connect with friends and family and share their experiences. And then software developers run the stack below that to make that all possible. And I think, a lot of innovation will come from software development going forward.
Mm. And would we say the job is changing in a big time with like the tech you're building right now with Copilot and other tools that are coming in the future? Like, how would you envision like a software engineer 20 years from now?
It's always changed, right? Like, if you go back to the example that you brought from the Linux magazine, and then you had to build your own kernel and install that, it would fail, and you have to go back. And before that, when when you were coding on a Commodore 64 and my first PC was a 386 DX40. You had to understand a lot about the system architecture, the CPU and the registers in the CPU and the fast cache and the slow cache and the memory. And then you had maybe a disk drive, but that was way slower than the memory. And so, the famous, Bill Gates 640K RAM thing, where you basically that meant you had to load stuff from disk and write it to disk to basically offload stuff from RAM because you had no space left. Nobody does that anymore, right? Like we've long moved on from that kind of like systems thinking and understanding like the intricacies of these systems. And nowadays we build large scale systems that run on, thousands of containers in multiple regions. Although, quite frankly, we still haven't
quite inefficient.
We still haven't really figured out, for example, to build a platform that has data residency around the world, right? That is fully distributed. There's lots of challenges to solve. And so when you ask me about 20 years is a long time, by the way.
Let's say 5. Let's say 5. Let's start with 5.
I mean, I think the Copilot and generative AI will make it possible that we can keep the exponential growth curve of all these lines of code and all these systems that we're building and staying sane at the same time. Like you have to manage all that code and you have to manage all the security vulnerabilities that some scanner finds in that code, or maybe it's just linter warnings. You have to, refactor as go from a system that scales to 1,000 users to 10,000, 100,000 and so on, right? Like, you start a new startup here today. You can't build a platform of the scale of Facebook. That doesn't make any financial sense, and you probably waste so much money that by the time you launch, you're already bankrupt, right? So you have to kind of like start at a smaller scale that is just big enough to find product market fit, and maybe like a little bit bigger to scale to the next round to survive, until you have the next funding round or enough cash flow. To make enough money from your revenue streams. But so you grow, every time you grow another magnitude, you effectively have to re-architect what you had in the past. And, as we all know by now, that is hard. Often we want to just throw everything away and rewrite it. And then that fails because by the year 3, you're into that rewrite project, you realize that in the meantime, your main stack has moved on as well and then had innovation. And so I think, AI will help us in many fashions, whether it's auto-completion today with Copilot or whether it's in the future test generation, boilerplate testing, in general, finding test cases and driving up your test coverage as part of CID, CD, all the way to, deploying to the cloud and analyzing, anomalies in your Datadog data or whatnot. I think all that will be supported by AI to let us up-level, to let us upskill, to run these monster systems in every country on the planet.
And maybe help us migrating away from COBOL, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's, that is an increasingly common, request that we're seeing, that people see AI as a way to modernize the existing software. And the way this, conceptually probably will work is that you use a model like, ChatGPT or Copilot to describe all that code and kind of like iteratively on a more like a longer time scale, describe what's in each of these methods. And so you get a description and you can review that. And then you can kind of like do the same and generate test cases that clearly didn't exist in the 60s, like who was doing unit testing and agile back then. And then you have kind of like the description and test case against that old code base. And now you can start refactoring into or rewriting into Python. And certainly a generative AI Copilot can help you with that. And it can give you ideas. And you still have to have a human involved to kind of validate the output, but you can see how by letting the model and the product loop over kind of like the old code base and the test cases, that it iteratively improves the code to a point where you have 99.9 also probability that the new system equals the old system. You can kind of see that when you work with ChatGPT and you ask it a question, you get a wrong answer. You can tell it that the answer was wrong, and it usually then apologizes and gives you a better answer. And then you can say, well, you're engineering the prompt effectively, and you're adding stuff to the prompt until you get it to the point where everything it has said before and everything you have said before gets it to the almost right solution or almost perfect solution, I guess.
Yeah. Happy to see how this will work with real code, right? I mean, well, with ChatGPT, you can already like quite easily code, but then like really running this stuff at the same time, testing the stuff at the same time, and seeing the final result?
You can already do that with ChatGPT. You paste some Java code and tell it to rewrite that code on Python, and it will do that. And Copilot, has Copilot Labs had a feature for that for almost a year, and Copilot Chat now obviously also does that, where you literally just highlight code in your editor and you go into the chat site in VS Code and say, hey, explain that code to me, or find a bug in that code. And once you do that, obviously knowing that it has an understanding of what the code does also means that you can now ask it to write a test case. And it often actually can write multiple test cases at once, and they're pretty good. And then it can rewrite that code into Python method by method, or like selected lines by each other. And it won't be perfect. And humans are not perfect either. Human programmers make bugs, and so you still need human code review.
Much more than ChatGPT does.
I think in a way, all these DevOps practices that we have internalized and ultimately introduced into our companies have created the safeguards, the quality gates, to make sure that whatever code AI is generating at the leftmost position in the developer lifecycle help us. It's almost like we played 4D chess and introduced web DevOps 10 years ago to be now prepared to leverage AI to its fullest potential, right? Because model hallucinations exist. AI will output wrong code. But then you still have a human code review. And if you've ever worked in a team of developers, you don't want to be the guy that always commits pull requests that are broken. And you don't want to be the one that always gets the feedback, hey, Thomas, your code sucks. And you got to rewrite that before we ever merge that into main, right? So there's some social gamification in our teams already, where the developers in the team pull each other up to hopefully the level of the best developer on the team. And then there's obviously CI/CD and all these processes, security scanning and secret scanning that automatically verify the code as well. And and then hopefully when you merge, you deploy to staging or canary system first, or have feature flags. Feature flags. That goes back to what I said earlier about startups and then scale, right? Like if you just experiment and you build an idea, you want to have that to happen as cheap as possible. As you scale bigger, you have to think about how you build all these quality gates into your pipeline to not breaking all the existing users that are happily paying you.
I think that thinking about scale later is actually one of the things that many CTOs learn the hard time, right? First you build something that is made for scale, really, in the very early days. Just realize that it's no product market fit. I think it's fascinating to see how this changed in the last years. That many people over-engineered quite a lot years ago, and I think that's no longer possible. How do you see that?
I think these days, the most CTOs think about scale from maybe it's not day one, but day two. As soon as the estimates came back from the engineering teams of how long it takes to build something, the feedback is going to be, why does it take us so long? And because the pressure is there from the business side to ship faster, whether it's features or new systems projects, and so you're automatically in a mode where you are debating within the engineering team, how can we get this job done in the shortest amount of time, while at the same time preparing us for future scale. And then the big question always is, how big is that scale going to be? As soon as your company has some product managers and a customer success team or some version of a revenue organization, you're going to have some kind of feedback loop, and there's some optimism on one side and some pessimism on the other side, and it often shifts around in companies. And sometimes the engineers are too optimistic and the sellers are too pessimistic, or it's vice versa. And the sellers think they can sell that to 1,000 companies within the first months, and then comes the first month is over and they actually only sold it to 3 people, and it needs them another 6 months until they have reached the scale that they thought they were going to have in the first month. And you have that challenge as CTO, CEO, CPO, it doesn't really matter, of kind of predicting what the future is going to be, and whether the product that you're building right now is going to have product market fit. And the luxury problem that you're going to have is if you have product market fit, your growth is probably faster than you have predicted. And so you have to always catch up with the bad decision, quote unquote, bad decisions you made on the first day when you thought, oh, this is never going to work, but let's ship it and see if the sellers can sell it, and vice versa. And so I think you think about it all the time. And the challenge that we have is that there is no ground truth. We could just apply some algorithms, or can just ask ChatGPT what the right approach is. You have to learn from experience, and hopefully your product managers give you some market insights, and maybe sales has already a pipeline of customers that can. The more data you have, the better decisions you're going to make. But even then, we're wrong as much as we're right.
So. You also have a lot of data at GitHub.
Yeah,
I guess I'm a bit jealous. What are your key challenges in your day to day? What are your biggest challenges these days?
As GitHub, I think the big challenge that we have is that with the popularity of DevOps and software development moving clearly to the cloud, and AI has in a certain degree accelerated this. The challenges are exactly what we just discussed at scale, and having the system scale, from supporting thousands of open source projects to now supporting thousands of large enterprise companies. And as those enterprises come and not only deploy their repositories onto GitHub, but also deploy their teams on GitHub, and now have organizations of 40,000-50,000 developers, and then all of a sudden you realize, okay, so if they're now adding all these 50,000 people to a new repo, how do you actually make that happen, that it doesn't bring the system down for everybody else? We have to, I think, in many ways, GitHub operates like any other company. We're always on the struggle between too many ideas and too many challenges, positive and negative challenges, and not enough time. And so you have to play the prioritization game every single day of figuring out, what is it, what we're doing next. And I think that's the biggest challenge, the challenge of our lives, really, to make those right decisions. So the company grows and the platform grows, and every customer ultimately is happy.
Are you personally involved in this struggle, this prioritization struggle, and what's your role in that?
My role is the role of I'm the CEO, and so I have a leadership team, and I have a chief product officer, and my CTO is right now, it's SVP of engineering and CISO. It doesn't have the CTO title, but is effectively a CTO, chief revenue officer. So I have my leadership team of 8 people that run their organizations, and then the biggest challenges come onto my desk, right? That those challenges that they cannot solve by themselves, they land on my desk, and we have to work through those challenges. And I think the biggest energy I get is from talking to customers and seeing how GitHub can help them, and with Copilot. In many ways, we hit the jackpot before there was any hype around AI, and so that that those discussions have changed dramatically over the last year, and I put a lot of energy out of that I can bring back to my leadership team to enable them to make the right decisions and move forward with their teams and their goals.
Did you ever had the goal to become more generalistic, when you were back then a freelance software developer? It's kind of a big pivot you went through. Did you ever have that goal, or was it just happening?
I don't know if I don't think I had this moment where I was I want to become a CEO and I want to have all this knowledge about HR and finance, legal, and all the company functions that are non-technical. As a startup founder, I think automatically get dragged into this. We were at Hockey, we were a 10-person startup, and I was the CEO because every German GmbH needs to have a managing director, and then it sounds much cooler on LinkedIn to call yourself a CEO. Obviously, for many reasons, that is a bit of a BS title, right? Because like there's no C-suite in a 10-person startup. There were 10 engineers, and I was the one that also did payroll and sales conversations and managed the web page and together with one of my co-founders thought about what conferences we would go to and so on. And so, but then naturally you get dragged into all these other things, and you learn a lot about how to manage payroll and the books, close the books every month. And as I went through my own acquisition at Microsoft, and then went through the GitHub acquisition, and afterwards we acquired another handful of companies at GitHub. I learned a lot about these functions that ultimately prepared me for that job, and I find a lot of satisfaction out of having that generalistic or that broad knowledge about company, because that allows me to kind of like take the insights that I have. When I go on a sales trip in APAC, as an example, I not only see what's happening at the customer and hear from them, I also see my own sales team and Microsoft's sales team as an extension in those regions operating, and so I get that knowledge, and then I come back into my staff meeting, and I can share what both the good things are and the room for improvement that we have together in these conversations, in these processes. And I think that's really enjoyable, and I do like being a CEO that came out of a software development background.
Really interesting how you went through that. Do you have like tips you would give other CTOs out there, how to maybe overcome those challenges to focus on let's say the more generalistic things while having tech in mind?
I think there's obviously the ones that you hear everywhere, right? Like, which is no matter where you are in your career, you always have to have a learning mindset. Microsoft calls it the growth mindset, and not accepting that everything is static and we are born with leadership skills and whatnot, but realizing that we all need to learn and grow. And I think most CTOs, CEOs, C-suite leaders, a big part of their job is reading a lot of information, processing that information, self-reflecting on that information, whether I like Apple Notes. It's easy enough because I have it on all my devices. I don't have any sophisticated note-taking system. But sometimes it just helps to throw stuff into these notes. And you might never read it again, but just by the process of, synthesizing your thoughts after reading an article or preparing for podcasts, whatnot, you get the clarity, and ultimately as leaders, we need to have clarity. I mentioned already energy. I think that's the other one where I think you, when you're an individual contributor, when you're a software developer, most of your day is kind of like predefined. You wake up in the morning, you have whatever your favorite beverage is. For me, it's coffee, breakfast, or you pick up an item from the board, or maybe you have a stand-up meeting. Hopefully, it's not too long and not too boring. And then you start coding, and that's great. And as you become a leader, you get
very rewarding. Yeah,
very rewarding. You're rewarding as soon as you get and sometimes frustrating too. I remember the days where you try to find this one bug, and it was in the evening. You're so frustrated, and you just want to throw your laptop out of the window. And then the next morning, you wake up with a fresh mind, and all of a sudden you found it, and you're like, I did it, right? And as a leader, you're much more in a like structure of, okay, so here's the team meeting and the one-on-ones and customer meeting here, and so you're kind of like in a rhythm, and you have to learn that you're still in charge of your own destiny, and that means organizing your schedule in such a way that you keep the energy level high, and you're not starting your day with a 3-hour book review that doesn't actually interest you, that just somebody wanted you to be in that review, because when you have the C-suite leader in the review, it gives everybody a good feeling, and that's not a useful use of time, and it's certainly not giving you energy. And I would bet most CTOs are just multitasking and they're doing other stuff, email or messages, and so a lot of that is kind of also how do you keep yourself at high energy, and then how you take that and generate the energy with your teams. And if you have the clarity and if you have the energy, then you will have success.
What are the things giving you energy?
customer meetings for sure, like customer meetings, customer presentations, keynotes for conferences. And there's always you have always a bit of stage fright that never goes away. And you can listen to big rock stars and they tell you that they still have it and they overcome it by rehearsing and doing it more and practicing ultimately. It's not only the act of doing it. Oftentimes you don't get better by competing all the time. You have to basically go back into training camp and kind of like improve your skills. And customer meetings are in many ways the same. I love to do my customer meetings without any decks, and I just basically get in a room with, the CTO and the directs or like a group of developers and start a conversation. And usually we will run out of time soon enough from that conversation, and I will have learned something about them, and they will have learned hopefully have something from me. But certainly I will have improved my pitch, and I will have, kind of like seen what resonates when you have something new, right? And what doesn't resonate, and where they're like quickly diverging back, to the topic that was interesting them instead of what I'm trying to sell. And so that gives me a ton of energy.
Product discovery, right? It's product discovery.
And you come out of these meetings and, you're like, more often than not, you're like psyched. And then you're like, oh, yeah, this was great. And it's not like everybody just signs a deal afterwards. In today's world, everything is consumption based. And then they start with a couple of seats and then they ramp up, and sometimes the ramps are faster and sometimes they're slower. But there's often, especially with GitHub, we always come, with our swag, and we're wearing our own, t-shirts and hoodies, and then we have stickers. And then so there's also that, certainly the emotions that people have about GitHub, are very similar to popular consumer brands. And that's something that gives me a lot of energy, and that I can bring back to the team and say, hey, we're really onto something here, and we should keep pushing and keep the tempo high.
Yeah, it's really like a community brand in a way, right?
Well, it's the interesting thing about GitHub is that it is both in a way, consumer is like a little strange, because obviously it's not consumer good that's sold in a grocery market or on Amazon, but it is a consumer brand in many ways that a lot of humans are to a certain degree looking into computer science and coding, whether it's kids in school, students in college, or somebody that's trying to, hack their home automation. And so you have this consumer side, quote unquote consumer side of GitHub, and you go to a Starbucks, and the barista might ask you, hey, you work for GitHub, because they recognize, the AutoCAD on my t-shirt, and you don't have many enterprise companies that create those same emotions. And then that other side of GitHub is an enterprise company. We sell enterprise software to all sizes of and all industries around the world, from cloud native startups all the way to automotive companies and banks and governments. And so we have these, it's an enterprise company with a consumer arm, both coming together. And more often than not, the buyers and the fans in those enterprise companies started somehow their open source career on GitHub, or their developer career.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's amazing. Do you have a mentor?
I have a coach, or I have gone through a number of coaches. And I would say a lot of people at Microsoft are, informal mentors. Like, they're not called my mentor, but obviously I have a lot of, leaders at Microsoft and in the industry, in the software industry, that I, can ping and ask the question. I have a coach, that, I talk with on a regular basis and ask questions and present kind of like the challenges of my day. And, coaching is kind of like, he doesn't give me advice. He asks me how to solve it. That's always the coaching thing, is kind of like you tell your coach the challenges that you have, and then coach is not, oh, you should do this and this, and which is kind of like what I thought I would want. And then instead he's asking me, so how could you solve this? And it kind of like forces you to figure it out yourself. And the coach helps you in that thought process. And then you can kind of rinse and repeat after the coaching session. But yeah, I had multiple coaches over the years, and I enjoy doing that.
And kind of a role model or something which you constantly observe?
I think, there's the obvious answers. I looked up to Steve Jobs for a long time, from a product perspective, and the way he approached building beautiful products together with Johnny Ive, and from the way he's was telling the story of Apple and of each individual Apple product at every keynote that he ever gave, right? That a lot of that, I think, is my generation is looking up to Steve Jobs and want to build like an Apple-like company from that product focus. And as a CEO, it's a bit of a you want to be Steve Jobs and you don't want to be Steve Jobs, I think, because obviously, the guy had such a understanding of product and design, and then presumably spent hours in with Johnny every day, kind of like PMing the product as the CEO. And the other side is that as a good CEO, you trust your leadership team, and you don't want to be the PM that looks into every nitty-gritty detail of the product, micromanaging certain aspect of the company while letting other things run by itself. And so, but there's merit to both of these approaches, and I think taking a step back every now and then and reading a page out of Steve Jobs' life is not a bad idea.
What was your latest wow moment when you saw something in tech which is not like produced by GitHub? Well, or you can mention the one from GitHub and the other one.
I mean, I think the answer that latest is depending. You didn't say how long I can go back, so I'd say ChatGPT. Certainly in November surprised all of us, and it really started as this. OpenAI launched this thing as an experiment, and they didn't have in their mind that it would become $100 million user platform within a week. Yeah. And you don't often see that, certainly not from an AI studio that was focused on machine learning research, all of a sudden launching a product like ChatGPT. And whether it's for the iPhone moment or something else, I think the comparison with Netscape and Mosaic in '93 is actually to a certain degree better, because it had a lead time between Tim Berners-Lee inventing the first server and browser, and then HTML coming up, and all of a sudden the browsers really start to become popular. And I didn't have a modem until I think 95 or 96. So even that was a long period of time that today is unthinkable because everybody is so well connected. But certainly it changed the world forever. Having the internet available in our pockets, and I think ChatGPT changed that again. And obviously, there was AI before that, whether it was the AI on your phone, whether asking Google or Siri, and the AI that detects all the faces in your photos. And I think most people don't actually know that they can just go into their photo library and search text, and it knows what's in those photos, because it has already analyzed those photos with AI to detect whether you have whatever, bread in the photo, even though you never tagged a photo with bread. And so AI was in our lives before ChatGPT, but ChatGPT opened everybody's eyes. And since then, an open source ecosystem has evolved around this, and LangChain is probably the other surprise in the last 6 months, from out of nowhere to big funded startup with big ideas.
Yeah, it's hard to follow, right? I mean, it's so much happening these days since that moment that it's really hard to keep track of it. I find it amazing as well.
Well, can you use AI for that?
Yes.
Just have AI as artifact.
Is this relevant to me or not?
Yeah, that's the Instagram founders. I built this app called Artifact that I'm using, that uses AI to kind of learn from my reading habits what I'm interested in. So I get a lot of links and articles to that. And obviously, when you're in the industry, you have enough team members that send you stuff day in, day out. So yeah, it's hard to follow, but at the same time, I think this goes back to the growth mindset, right? Like perfectionism is the enemy of that. You don't have to read everything. Yeah. It's totally fine to not read a blog end to end, and you can kind of start reading. And if you figure out this is going way too technical, you can actually ask ChatGPT to summarize it to you if you need to. But you don't have to read everything to understand what's currently happening. And I think it has been probably the most exciting thing for software developers, certainly in the last 30 years.
Absolutely. So slowly coming to the end and my popular outro question. It's a little surprise. I guess you know Chris Wentworth, right? Like he was working for GitHub for ages, and he actually built an Easter egg into the timeline view, and he told me about that. You can just add like a get parameter, which makes it very, very easy to just travel back in time physically. And we now have the chance to travel back in time to the year 2009, when you started working as a freelance software engineer for MTV Networks. Funny enough, I checked that on LinkedIn. And we now observe yourself for a little while. You were doing some, I don't know, what have you been coding there? Like HTML partly. And you now have the chance to whisper something into young Thomas' ears. What would it be?
2009, I had just end of 2008, I quit my job at Bosch and became like a freelance software developer. That wasn't startup yet. It was just we were coding projects in German, from German companies, and MTV, through like a friend of a friend, approached us and we built a platform called Game One, which was like a TV show on MTV back then about gaming, and then we built like a little mini YouTube, like a blog plus videos, and you could basically watch other gamers playing. That was before Twitch and the likes, and so we were building Ruby on Rails apps in 2009 already with HTML and JavaScript and then iPhone apps, right? And that was the ultimate goal of us, to kind of like make a living of building iPhone apps, and then out of that came Hockey app. I think if I could go back and whisper something in my ears, in Germany, as a startup founder, you're much more conservative compared to a startup founder on the West Coast in terms of how you approach things, whether you're taking capital or not, how fast you're trying to predict or how fast you're growing, and how fast you can kind of predict your future. The optimism is much bigger in the Bay Area and now really the extended West Coast, and to certain degrees, in the startup scene in the United States. And I'd say, pessimism or realism, whatever I'd like to call that, in Germany is much bigger than that. And I think I would probably go back to myself and say, tell me, be a bit more optimistic about what the future could bring, and try to grow faster, both as a human and as a startup, and savor the moments. I wouldn't go back in life and make many changes. I'd probably, enjoy some moments a little bit more intentional. Because you never get, those times back, and you always want your vacation to be longer, and it won't be. So you have to enjoy every moment of a vacation.
And don't spend your vacation with podcasts. Huh?
I mean, I think that's it's always the things that make you like a little bit uncomfortable that also move you forward in your career or really in your life. And tonight I will be excited about how the day went, and so yeah.
Absolutely. So Thomas, was great having you as my guest, and maybe we can repeat it in the future. I then visit you all there in the Microsoft offices. Thanks a lot for being my guest, and I hope to see you soon.
Thank you so much for having me, and see you soon.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Alphalist podcast. If you liked this episode, share it with friends. I'm sure they love it too. Make sure to subscribe so you can hear deep insights into technical leadership and technology trends as they become available. Also, please tell us if there is a topic you would like to hear more about, or a technical leader whose brain you would like us to pick. Alphalist is all about helping CTOs getting access to the insights they need to make the best decisions for their company. Please send us suggestions to CTO@alphalist.com. Send me a message on LinkedIn or Twitter. After all, the more knowledge we bring to CTOs, the more growth we see in tech. Or, as we say on Alphalist, accumulated knowledge to accelerate growth. See you in the next episode.